My name is Lauren Myers, and I'm 32. The house had a scent I can't quite put my finger on. A mix of fresh paint and my mom's cooking, with a subtle warmth. A scent you only find in places built with love over decades. My parents didn't give me a ribbon-wrapped present. They gave me the fruit of 20 years of double shifts, missed vacations, and silent sacrifices that I only fully understood when I was old enough to count them. My dad drove the same rusty car for 11 years to save money. My mom wore the same winter coat for 7 seasons. When I turned 29, they sat me down at the kitchen table, gave me a set of keys, and simply said, "This is your home now." I cried for 20 minutes straight. I moved in with my husband, Matthew, 8 months before the problems started. At first, everything in our life in that house felt like the beginning of something real. Sunday breakfast, holiday decorations, the quiet, relaxing rhythm of 2 people building their home together. Matthew was attentive, cheerful, and I genuinely believed we agreed on everything important. I told him the whole story of the house, every detail of what my parents had sacrificed, and what the address meant to our family, and he nodded and said he understood. I believed him. That was my first mistake. The change began gradually, as with most harmful things. Matthew started mentioning his mother, Margaret, more frequently in his conversations. Vivian needed more space. She wasn't comfortable in her apartment. Vivian had always wished for her own room when she visited. At first, I listened without alarm, thinking they were just passing remarks, the kind that would fade away on their own, but they didn't. Chapter 2. The house my parents built with 20 years of sacrifice. Things piled up. One November evening, Matthew sat across from me at the dining table. The same table my parents had chosen together at auction 30 years earlier, and told me he was seriously considering converting the guest room and the small study into permanent quarters for his family, his mother, his younger brother, and his brother's girlfriend. 3 people, 2 rooms in a house my parents had dedicated their lives to giving me. I stared at him, waiting for him to say he was joking. But he didn't. I cautiously asked if he'd forgotten whose house it was. He said something that still echoes in my mind. "What's yours is ours, Lauren." I didn't respond immediately. I let the sentence hang in the air between us, and I noticed he didn't flinch. He'd practiced this. He was comfortable saying it. 3 days later, Margaret arrived with 2 suitcases and the energy of someone who'd already decided to stay. She walked into my front door uninvited and began inspecting the rooms like a landlord before renovations. She opened the doors, commented on the cupboard sizes, glanced into the study, and nodded with a satisfaction that made me uneasy. Matthew stood a little behind her, like a man who knew he'd made a mistake, but had gone too far. Vivian found me in the kitchen and delivered a speech she'd clearly rehearsed. She spoke of family unity, of how, in her culture, families didn't let their members face hardship alone. She spoke of Matthew's unwavering generosity and her hope that his wife would follow suit. Every sentence seemed designed to portray any dissent as selfish. I recognized her tactic. I'd heard manipulative speeches before, but not in my kitchen. Then she reached out and, without hesitation or even realizing what she was asking for, asked me directly for a copy of the house keys. The kitchen fell silent, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. I heard Matthew shift behind his mother. At that moment, I felt something unexpected stir within me. Not anger, not panic, just a strange calm. That kind of calm that only comes when you fully understand what's happening and what you're going to do about it. I looked at Vivian's outstretched hand. I looked at her face, which bore the expression of someone accustomed to receiving what they ask for. Then I smiled. Not a polite smile, not a nervous one, but a steady, calm smile of a woman who knows something the other person in the room doesn't. I put down the dish towel I was holding. I stood up and said something so calm and clear, without a tremor in my voice, that it froze Matthew completely and caused the color to drain from Vivian's face as quickly as a light going out behind her eyes. But before I tell you what I said, I want you to understand everything that came before that moment, because words are meaningless unless you know the weight of what lies behind them. I said, "Vivian, I think there's been a misunderstanding, and I'd like to clear it up now that we're all here together." My voice didn't tremble. I was even surprised by that. Matthew had taken a small step forward, as people do when they feel a situation is about to spiral out of control. But Margaret's outstretched hand remained unmoved. It waited with practiced patience, like someone expecting the world to eventually respond. I let the silence linger for another second, just enough for both of us to feel the weight of the situation, and then I continued. I told her this house wasn't Matthew's to give away. I told her it wasn't mine to share in the way she imagined. I told her slowly and clearly that this house had belonged to my parents first, that my father's 11 years in a rusty car held together by his stubbornness were etched into these walls, that my mother's 7 winters in a coat that was supposed to be replaced were etched into this foundation, and that when they placed those keys in my hands, they were placing 30 years of their lives in mine. And I wasn't going to hand over any part of that to someone who walked through my door with suitcases and a renovation plan, and called it family unity. Margaret's hand fell. Not slowly. She fell like things do when the muscles that support them stop receiving the signal to stay still. Her face, which had held that calm, feigned confidence since the moment she arrived, did something I'd never seen it do before. It froze, then paled. Then the expression that had replaced confidence was closer to shock. Honest, spontaneous, it hit like ice water. "My name," Matthew said. "Just my name. Like people say when they have nothing else ready." I turned to him then because what I wanted to say was more for him than for her. I told him I loved him and that I'd been true to every promise I'd made on our wedding day. But that love didn't mean abandoning the evidence of my parents' lives. I told him that what belonged to me belonged to all of us. I completely agreed. But what belonged to my parents was sacred, and they weren't the same. Somewhere in planning this conversation, he'd mixed them up, and I wanted him to clarify immediately. I went to the kitchen drawer, the second from the left, where I keep the house documents. I took out the file my father had prepared when he transferred ownership, neatly arranged like everything else, meticulously and carefully, every page in its proper place. I placed it on the table. I opened it to the page with the names. I turned it so their names were facing me and tapped once on the important line. My name only, not Matthew's, not a family name, not a shared name, just my own. Vivian looked at the document. She stared at it for a long time. Matthew looked at it too, and something about him changed. A slow, complete shrinkage, like air leaving something that had been overinflated for too long. I told Margaret directly, without harshness or gentleness, that she was welcome in my home as a guest. I told her that guest rooms were for guests, that I held no personal grudge against her, and that I didn't want to create a rift between Matthew and his family, but that the talk about keys, permanent rooms, and redecorating a house my parents had sacrificed 2 decades to build was over. It was over the moment she reached out her hand, and she would leave today knowing she had left that evening. She didn't leave in a huff, as I had expected. I left with something calmer than anger, a kind of rebalancing, the adjustment one makes when they realize the room they entered wasn't the one they'd planned for. Matthew drove her to her sister's house across town. He came home 2 hours later and sat across from me, silent for about 5 minutes. When he finally spoke, he didn't defend her, or himself. "I should have talked to you before all this happened," he said. I told him he was right. He said he understood it now more clearly than ever before. I told him that this realization was the only way forward, so we had to start from there. We spent the next 3 weeks having the most honest conversations of our marriage. Things that had been simmering beneath the surface came to light, and patterns that had been quietly forming emerged. It was unsettling, as is often the case with necessary things. It was also the first time I felt we were building something together, rather than just living apart within the same walls. Matthew called his mother twice a week. She was kind to me when we spoke, wary of someone trying to push new boundaries. It wasn't warmth, not immediately, but it was respect. And respect, I've learned, is sometimes the truest expression of warmth. It doesn't ask you to feel something you don't feel, it only asks you to acknowledge what is. My parents don't know most of what happened. My mother was worried, and my father was silent the way he is when something he holds dear is threatened, and I didn't want to burden him with that. What I do know is that the house still smells the same: fresh paint, wood polish, and a lingering warmth. My father's 11 years are still etched in these walls, and my mother's 7 winters are still etched in this foundation. And the keys are where they belong, in my hands, where my parents put them.
अंधेरी दीवारों में खुद को ढूंढता हूँ मैं, ये जो दिन सहाने थे उन्हीं को सोचता हूँ मैं। तुम्हारे बिन ये मौसम भी बड़ा बेसर्द लगता है। दिल का हर एक कोना अब बहुत ही दूर भरता है। अंधेरी दीवारों में खुद को ढूंढता हूँ मैं, ये जो दिन सुहाने थे उन्हीं को सोचता हूँ मैं। तुम्हारे बिन ये मौसम भी बड़ा सर्द लगता है। दिल का हर एक कोना बहुत ही दर्द भरता है। मेरे साए भी मुझसे अब जुदा होने को कहते हैं, तुझे खोने की राहों में ये आंसू बहने लगते हैं। सितारों से भी पूछता है पता तेरा कहाँ होगा, मगर खामोश है दुनिया, कहाँ मेरा जहाँ होगा। बस एक बार मुड़ के देख ले मेरी बेबसी की सूरत, मुझे है आज भी तेरी वफा की सख्त जरूरत। साए मेरे तन्हा सफर बस रह गया दर्द का असर, साए मेरे तन्हा सफर बस रह गया दर्द का असर, दर्द का असर।